absolutely it. If any other girls would do as I do, I believe that we could manage it alone. But I turn all suitors from me with the sailor and the Tommy. I've an army and a navy of my own. On Sunday, I walk out with the soldier. Monday, I'm taken by a car. Tuesday, I'm out with a baby, Boy Scout. On Wednesday, huzzah! On Thursday, I gang out with Scotty. On Friday, the captain of the crew. But on Saturday, I'm willing, if you'll only take the shilling, to make a man of any one of you. I teach the tenderfoot to face the powder. That gives an added luster to my skin. And I show the raw recruit how to give a chaste salute. So when I'm presenting arms, he's falling in. It makes you almost proud to be a woman. When you make a strapping soldier of a kid. And he says, you put me through it. And I didn't want to do it. But you went and made me love you. So I did. On Sunday, I woke up with a Boston. On Monday, a rifleman in green. On Tuesday, I choose a star in the blue. On Wednesday, a Marine. On Thursday, a carrier from shooting. On Friday, a midshipman or two. But on Saturday, I'm willing, if you'll only take the shilling, to make a man of any one of you.
And so on. I've called this, welcome, hello, good to see you. I've called this lecture, what, oh, come on, slideshow thing, off. There we go. Right. I called it, what were the consequences for design of the First World War? And having decided to call it that, it occurred to me that actually this is such a big subject that in 40 minutes, 45 minutes, or whatever time we have, it's almost impossible to do that question justice. So what I'm going to do is take a sort of zigzag route along some of the things that happened in the First World War, and principally I'm going to be looking at technology. The thing that I've just shown you is a reminder that it's taken from a film called Oh, What a Lovely War. When I was in my teenage years, early 20s, there was a show and then a film that came out in 1968, that film called Oh, What a Lovely War. And it shaped a generation's attitudes to what the First World War was about. And Oh, What a Lovely War was initially a musical, a show, and then it was a film. And what the people doing that did was try to tell the entire story of the First World War as if it were an end of the pier show. So you saw Maggie Smith there doing her music hall number, but the point about it was to take a sideways glance at something that was so tragic, so horrific, that it obliged you to think very, very hard about the manner in which you should consider it. So I'm going to suggest three ideas, and they're different kinds of ideas. I'm going to suggest that one of the consequences for design of the First World War arose out of a set of technological innovations. So literally, developments that occurred in the First World War. The other two are different kinds of changes. One of them is this: enthusiasm for technology and the future, and a rejection of the past. And quite why the war might lead to that, we'll consider shortly. And the second of these is a fear of technology and of the future, and an enthusiasm for the past. So the direct opposite of that one. The point about these two, numbers 2 and 3, is that unlike technology itself, if you like, the nuts and bolts, those are very much to do with attitudes towards technology. And I'm going to suggest to you that the First World War was able to generate both of these conflicting attitudes. In order to understand the First World War, we need to know a little bit about where it came from. This is the tiniest of sketches. We're thinking about a period, and largely we're thinking about a period in European history. The First World War is much wider than Europe, although it's Europe that we tend to focus on. I'm starting with a map of Africa to remind us that this was very much an imperialist war, a war between imperialistic nations. And here we have a map of Africa in 1845. It is absolutely a European map of Africa. This is showing you what Europeans sort of knew about Africa in about 1845. And essentially, the coloured bits are where Europeans had been and noticed things and traded, most of it to do with the slave trade, particularly that stuff on the western coast of Africa. But it's worth reminding ourselves that if we're thinking about the World War in a world context, that's only one perspective on Africa, and we could have a look at another, a retrospective map developed, which is showing some of the incredibly sophisticated civilizations that existed in Africa in that grey bit that was shown in that earlier map. And this you could have shown perhaps in 1845, but the Europeans by 1912, by just before the First World War, had Africa all neatly chopped up, a set of resources, competition between European countries to secure these resources for their raw materials, but also for reasons of status. And there is rivalry principally between Britain and Germany, but also other countries are represented there, the French, the Belgian, notoriously the Belgians. And if that's about raw materials, then we also need to think about these countries as being countries that were in the process of industrialization. In Britain, it was pretty far advanced. The German Industrial Revolution, if we use a loose term like that, happened later. We were manufacturing industries, cotton, iron, steel, railways, that kind of thing. In Germany, certainly the steel industry and railways took off, but chemicals, electronics, other kinds of industry. But industrialization is occurring. We need to know these things because they affect how the war unfolds. And there were trade wars between Britain and Germany. And this shows a couple looking into some future date. The continental supply stores full of inexpensive foreign goods. But the suggestion is that if one allowed free trade to occur, if you didn't have tariffs stopping goods coming in that were cheaper, then it would impoverish everybody and nobody would be able to buy those things in the first place. So, looking at the European countries, and I am going to principally consider Britain, I'm saying Britain, but you know really it's England, and Germany. There are differences and similarities. Germany doesn't exist as a country until 1870. It exists as a culture, but not as a unified country. However, it is eager to establish itself as a European power and has been terrifically successful in war. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when Germany emerges out of military triumph over the French. And they are building imperial-looking buildings, this is the Reichstag, for an imperial city, for Berlin. And their cities, this is Unter den Linden in Berlin, are, again, it's turning it into a potential centre for an imperial power. And you'll notice here there's signs of technology. So there are posters for things that have been printed. There's a motor bus, bicycles. The technology is in there. Those might even be, I don't know whether those are aerials. I think they're flagpoles. Meanwhile, in Britain, we too, in London, are fashioning an imperial city. So this is the front of Buckingham Palace. You won't recognise it. That front doesn't exist anymore. There we have the monument to Queen Victoria, Empress of India, created in the 1880s. Empress of India. So very much a self-conscious sense of an imperial nation. And in order to give Buckingham Palace a more fashionable and arguably more elegant and cultured facade, Edward VII contrives for the present facade of Buckingham Palace to be built by Sir Aston Webb, and likes it. So London is also an imperial city. Essentially, the powers in Europe are vying with one another for status, and it's a very public vying. This is a cartoon from a magazine called Puck, and they're joking about going to war. They don't know what the First World War is going to be like, but they're saying, oh look, here we are, we've got all these things that are coming, and notice most of them are technological innovations that they're sat round a gambling table and threatening to hurl at one another. And make no mistake, and you can take this from that video clip as well, the idea of war, before the war, was popular. It absolutely sold newspapers. It got people going. And that, I might add, is on both sides. So, the equivalent of the Prince of Wales for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as the Emperor Franz Joseph, he's been there since the 1840s. There's this aging Prince of Wales, there's this familiar, and he's making a trip to some obscure part of that empire which stretches for quite a long way. And he's going for a drive with his wife in Sarajevo, and an anarchist shoots him dead. So it's the equivalent of the Prince of Wales being shot dead. This does not cause the First World War. This triggers the First World War. It means that those pent-up things that have been talked about, have been endlessly discussed, start to happen. So it's against that background that we're going to consider some technological innovations. The First World War is distinguished by being the first fully industrial, technological war of the machine. We'll come back to this idea of the machine shortly. The technologies of communication that are connected with the First World War affected how it was conducted then, how, if you like, the people engaged in it reflected on what was going on, but also it affects how we think of it now. So there are any number of famous posters. Maybe the most famous one is Your Country Needs You, but I've got a couple of other ones here. There's a public culture of posters, propaganda posters. These are ones for the British saying, will you fit in? And these children asking this man after the war is over and won, what did you do in the war, Daddy? What did you do in the Great War, as they came to think of it? So there's a lot of pressure on people to volunteer at this stage, to volunteer to go into the army. And this is what they're fighting for. Essentially they're fighting for the countryside. You don't tend to fight for cities. Meanwhile, you know, some nice unbiased propaganda is being produced. This is obviously what Germans are like. This is the beastly Hun. And there's a sort of rawness and coarseness to this kind of propaganda that I think we find shocking now, but there was a market for it, and indeed here we have the danger. The Germans are saying, watch out for the danger of Bolshevism. That's going to destroy civilization as we know it. And there are popular mass circulation newspapers in a way that there had never been before. So in Fleet Street, the technology is there, and it's producing these newspapers that are very, very widely read. It means that in thinking about how the war is prosecuted, people have points of reference, the newspapers, which they can refer to. There's something slightly tragic about this. I just love that there is Great Britain declares war on Germany, and there's an ad for practical hats. It's a reminder that this occurs into a world that is operating sort of normally, but the normalities start to change. It's worth also remembering that the camera plays a role in the First World War. This is a famous, and this is the camera and the newspapers coming together. So here we have a picture of the now legendary, now mythical, we need some question marks over this, meeting of German soldiers and English soldiers at Christmas in 1915, so it'll be 100 years this year. And a photograph to demonstrate that it did actually occur. Here's another photograph taken from that event. The First World War is inclined to elicit from people a slightly generalized sense of tragedy and sadness. I'm only knocking it slightly. I've got the poppy on. I'm wearing my poppy. I've never been obliged to fight in a war. Members of my family were. My dad was. There are probably members of your family who may have equally been obliged to fight wars, and indeed there may well be people in the room for whom First and Second World War is not the point of reference, but something more recent. I'm reminded of that when the poppies are sold, and so I buy one. This is that Christmas meeting again. I have to say, it turned my stomach last year when Sainsbury's decided that they would use that meeting of soldiers to sell chocolate. Marvellous. There was something just inherently revolting about that I struggled with. Pictures. They used the camera also in prosecuting the war in order to try and work out the terrain of the battlefield. So cameras were used, here we can see them used from aircraft, we'll come back to aircraft in a moment. So they had aerial photography, and these are, what do we call them? These are the, not battlements, there's a word for them, the trenches. These are the defences, the earthworks that are running, here we can see at Bullecourt in a part of northern France. So the camera is put to war. As a consequence, there are, and I'm not, again, I'm treading carefully here, there are sort of cliches about how we think of the war, and it's because for a century we have been remembering it in different ways. And imagery like this, black and white photographs of pretty grim trenches, the trench is seen as a distinctive First World War characteristic, trench warfare rather than open battlefields. And no man's land, what's left after battles have been fought. These images have become familiar to us. There's a risk, I suppose, that they become over-familiar and perhaps lose some of their power. And images indeed like this, where those figures that we saw earlier that were standing up, walking around, are not. They're dead. And we have some sense of the millions of people who died in the First World War. So in a generalized sense, that's where we come at it. It's sometimes difficult to imagine this happening to real people. And it's partly, I think, the distance that can occur because of black and white imagery. I was interested to come across this, which I hope is going to come up in a moment. Go on. Okay. And I thought we'd have a look at it. It's experimental colour film from Germany. I'm not sure about the portentous music, but I think the thing that that does is help remind us that, that this war happened to ordinary people who were leading ordinary lives, had girlfriends, smiled, drank coffee, had wine. I think somehow the colour does literally almost bring it to life, and it's a timely reminder because we're inclined, I think, to lose that sense in the more generalised sense of what it was that happened. Now, technology. War can accelerate technical developments. I think most people recognise that. Here's one. It's a machine for digging trenches. I think, candidly, the vast majority of trenches were dug by human beings, but they were trying to sort of technologise almost all human activities with a view to getting an edge in war. It also can be the thing that drives technological change in the sense of extinguishing some technologies. And one of the technologies of war that probably came to an end with the First World War was the technologies attached to using horses. Horses had been a part of warfare for several thousand years. And in the First World War, there was cavalry, and some people went to war on horses. My colleague Helena Chance, her, I think, great-uncle, Roger Chance, left, went to the First World War on a horse. And this became sort of the stuff of family legend. You can almost feel the sort of contradiction between the business of horses and the business of technology with this image of a horse with the equivalent of a Gatling gun strapped to it. The horse looks incredibly vulnerable, and indeed they were. So that was the end of horses. Pigeons featured in the First World War, some very old technology. There's something, I don't know, there's something about that image. The dove is a sign of peace. And here we have one coming out of an armoured gun placement to send a battle and prosecute war. Here we can see a First World War pigeon loft, a motorised pigeon loft, a means of communicating using ancient means. And here we can see a pigeon that's been adapted to be able to take photographs over enemy lines. That's an astonishing thing. There's other things that we don't now think about, but which at the time we thought, you know, this could really, really work. Listening devices. Could you tell what was happening with the enemy if you listened really carefully? Could technology help with that? Well, you could add something to your ears so that you could hear better, and you could actually do quite elaborate ones, and the bigger possibly the better. So there we have one, I think, being tested at Alexandra Palace, listening devices. Eventually in the Second World War these get supplanted by radar, but listening devices played a role in warfare right up until the Second World War. Here's a technology that's absolutely central to the manner in which the war was prosecuted, and that's railways. Here we can see people going off to the railway station in order to go to war. And sure, it moved the soldiers around. And A.J.P. Taylor argued famously in the 70s, I'm not sure that this argument is accepted too much now, but he argued that because the programme of moving soldiers by railway had been so meticulously planned, a lot of this, once the trigger went, if you like, happened almost like clockwork, so that some things were preordained to happen in a certain sequence. And he said all the mobilisation plans had been timed to the minute, months or even years before, and they could not be changed. Modification in one direction would ruin them in every other direction. Any attempt, for instance, by the Austrians to mobilise against Serbia would mean that they could not then mobilise against Russia, because two lots of trains would be running against one another. Railways also became a means of moving heavy artillery into the battlefield. And you can see the size of some of these. And these are to lob at other human beings. I mean, heaven knows human beings can be ingenious at how they try to kill one another. The truth of the matter is these really huge guns, because they could only be moved by railway, were of limited use because you could only move them where the rails were. The munitions, the millions of tons of munitions that were used in the First World War. There's somebody loading a gun now. There's somebody on the other side. That was the British side. This is a machine gun on the German side. A Minenwerfer, a mine thrower, which they're hurling at the opposition. Those all had to come from somewhere. And because of industrialization, it meant that there were munitions factories, and because the men had been sent to fight at the front, women came into the factories. They were even given the name munitionettes in order to give them a somewhat feminine quality. But jobs that had been the preserve of men became jobs that women did, and did well, and everybody was obliged to notice that. Not everybody was obliged to notice what the consequences of that might be. These munitions were produced literally in industrial quantities, masses and masses and masses of them, and they were flung at one another, principally in northern France and adjacent countries. For years they were flung at one another. In order to try and protect the machinery that they had, they armoured everything. They armoured the railways. This is the inside of an armoured train, and you can see the amount of technology. This is one that's been captured and has been sort of deserted. It's just heaving with killing devices. Even attempts at body armour. This is one. Here's another with little slits in the glasses so that you can see things through it. Strange. An attempt at armouring the equivalent of tractors and adding tracked wheels to them. Eventually, here we have two soldiers mounted in a car in separate turrets, armoured. And this proved to be the cutting-edge technology of the First World War. The tank, so called because it was developed in secret, and originally they called it the water container, because they didn't want anybody to know what it was that they were doing. But then they noticed that in all the communications that were going between the different committees, the water container had an unfortunate acronym, so they changed it to the tank, and the name has stuck. And there we can see it. Absolutely unknown before the First World War. This was the British secret weapon. It got so hot inside there that droplets of molten metal would be flying about. And this is an attempt to enable people to see but be protected by the molten metal. This is a French version of goggles. And inside the tank there is this hot engine that is thrashing away. These are not comfortable places. So those exhaust pipes would all be red hot. Okay, not red hot, but hot hot. And you're in there with them, and you're trying to prosecute a war by shooting at people. There are various different models. The British Whippet, capable of 13 kilometers an hour, which is quite fast for the time. The Germans tried to make tanks as well, and the French also did. Eventually, again, we have one of those arresting images, just a body just left there, a man there, he's sort of half smiling, I guess he's looking at somebody else, got a camera in his hand. Here we can see some French-built tanks built by Renault, the company that's still around at the moment, with American troops. These were actually quite effective because they got over difficult terrain. Unlike the railway that was obliged to go on rails, this could go across fields, could go across battlefields, and they were something of a success. And notice that they're eventually produced in their thousands. Britain produced about 1,400 of them. France produced about 4,000 of them in order to prosecute the war, with Germany a measly 20 and Italy 6. You can see the other numbers. and they are being produced industrially. This is another thing that is coming out of the factory system. Art. We could do art in the First World War. We're not going to do art, but we are going to look at applied art, and that is dazzle camouflage. Sometimes people develop theories about about visual perception, and a particular theory was developed whereby it was thought that if you took something large like a battleship that at sea would be vulnerable to being shot, if you covered it in crazy, really rather wonderful paintings, then what would happen is it makes the vessel unhittable rather than invisible. The early British dazzle scheme was based frankly on the assumption that invisibility at sea being unattainable, some protection may be offered by painting the ships in such a way as to confuse the enemy by causing some doubt as to the course, speed and distance, thus delaying the discharge of a torpedo. Now, actually, they did some tests later on, and eventually they concluded that the camouflage made absolutely no difference, but it did help raise morale, is the man who invented it, Norman Wilkinson. Quite astonishing treatments to these. Airships. Airships have been around since the 1870s. These were deployed in the First World War principally by Germany, and indeed they had the desired effect. They struck terror into the population of cities, and they bombed not only London, but also some cities in the north. I was telling you about Helena Chance's uncle. In my family, my father remembered as a child coming home with his mother in about 1915, 1916, and his mother bursting into tears because the front of their house in Kentish Town in North London, all the windows had been blown in and it looked like a wreck because there'd been an airship raid. The effect that it had was one of terrorizing the population, and to that extent it was effective. In terms of actually destroying things, possibly fractionally less effective. Here we go, Zeppelin raid over outer London. Aeroplanes. Before the First World War, aeroplanes are a bit like kites. They're sort of string and canvas. They're really very flimsy things. This is one from 1913. Very similar to the one that had just crossed the channel. We'll have... How are we doing for time? We all right?
Yeah.
Good. Let's just have a little bit of this. The use of the air as a battleground was a development of the First World War. It's now taken for granted, but it first emerged in the First World War.
Between 1914 and 1918, a revolutionary new theatre of war was created, the air. It brought sights never seen or imagined before. There were massive dogfights.
I can see the scene now. It was just like a cloud of flies in the sky. All moving quickly, of course, very quickly, and diving.
There were terrible crashes, and a casualty rate which at times meant pilots were almost certain to be killed.
I kissed my mother. I cleared everything right up, and I said, "Goodbye, Mum. I don't think I shall ever see you again." And that is the attitude you had to take. You were going to die.
This air war saw aeroplanes which somehow took off from a platform on a ship's guns. And the invention of a radical new concept, the aircraft carrier. It fueled a technological arms race as designers on both sides sought to outwit each other. A race which ushered in the modern age of fighters and bombers. And the hero, the ace.
So the effect of the war undoubtedly on aircraft was to spur development, and so those kite-like devices became much more sophisticated and robust. That man was the famous Red Baron, Baron von Richthofen. Here we see the triplanes that were made in Germany, the Fokker triplanes, terribly famous. And there he is. And the dogfights. And it got very cold up there. There was no heating inside the plane, so they tried developing electrical suits that would heat them up. Eventually they have air battles with hundreds of planes fighting. And again, these are produced in an industrial quantity. Telephones, widely deployed, wireless, a newish technology, widely deployed. Difficulty of getting electricity on the battlefield. So here we can see some Germans generating electricity on a sort of bicycle effect. Here's one attached to a motorcycle. So, there it is. It's been said that there were probably more military telephones serving the Allied lines on the Western Front than there were domestic phones in Britain, America and France put together. Poison gas, another technology of just hideousness. Some of it made people, well, I won't do that. Some of it made people vomit, some of it made them, poisoned them. And so they developed a mix of poison gases together, which meant that it would make people vomit, so it made them take the gas mask off, and then the gas that would poison them and kill them could get to them. So, in thinking about what happened as a result of the First World War, there are some odd things. Moustaches disappeared, which was strange. By the end of the war they'd sort of gone. It used to be, in the 1860s, it was compulsory for soldiers to have moustaches and was considered almost a part of their uniform. And yet by 1916 they'd abandoned all of that, not least because in trenches it was that much more difficult to attend to having a moustache washing. Wristwatches emerged. Up until that point the fob watch would have been the standard way that certainly a gentleman and perhaps even a lady might have known the time, and strapping one to your wrist became the standard thing to do, and that's the beginning of wristwatches. So I was suggesting these three things might account for some kinds of design innovations as a result of the war. So actual technical innovations, enthusiasm for technology and the future and rejection of the past, fear of technology in the future and enthusiasm for the past. In terms of technological innovations, we've seen a fair few. So the aircraft develop and become, at least for very rich people, you start to get scheduled airlines flying from different countries. The Channel had been crossed in 1910. In 1919, the first year after the First World War, Alcock and Brown make the first flight across the Atlantic, and eventually you have intercontinental travel, and it's quite small by our standards, but it occurred, and there we can see people enjoying being in the air. The radio, which again the war really gave a spur to communication, and that opened up a whole world for ordinary people eventually, because you could make a radio out of just a few components. Little boys used to make them and call them, they were called crystal sets. So this opened up a whole new type of communication for everybody. Enthusiasm for technology. We've just looked at technology being used to bash the living daylights out of people. How could there be an enthusiasm for technology coming out of the First World War? And yet there was. Partly It's because the imperial architecture, the things associated with, if you like, that system that had brought the war, not least in Germany, became for many, particularly left-wing intellectuals, desperately unattractive. And an architecture like this is the Bauhaus at Dessau, has a machine aesthetic. And the thing about the aesthetic is that it does not make references to that past that's all too immediate. This is emerging out of a post-First World War world. So the machine seems to hold out a possibility of a type of identity that is not rooted in national identity and not rooted in historical precedents. And that could extend to architecture, it could extend to furniture, it could extend to some rather unusual party masks. We celebrate these things now. They were actually only popular amongst a particularly narrow section of the population, but nonetheless they emerged then and proved models for many subsequent kinds of design. The Corbusier and the Village Savoie, and just a reminder that that white, pristine machine crispness is overlaid on a much more conventionally structured thing. So the machine, the ideal of the machine, this is an exhibition in 1914, before the First World War has happened. And look at those buildings. They could almost have been built in the 1950s, 1960s, maybe the 1930s. And they have a crispness and futurism to them. So the First World War did not generate these, but it gave a real spur to those who wanted to reject that earlier world. Here's an even earlier example from 1906 of a concrete building in France, an amazing garage. So it's not machinery, it's abstract ideas of the machine which inspire that particular change. And it comes to, at a quite popular level. So a shop front that looks as if somehow it's been wired up and electrified. Cinemas that promise to people, after all, who might not have much vested interest in the world as it was, a type of architecture that looks towards the future and which promises a world of some glamour. And I hasten to add, this is just a canter through some of these. I've not looked at social and political attitudes, I've not looked at senses of national identity, and I've not really considered mass communication and mass culture, except very superficially. Now, in parallel with this taking on of the machine as a way to escape some of the horrors that had happened, you get the fear of technology, pretty much understandable given some of the things that had happened, and an enthusiasm for the past. And you can see this sort of psychological tension in some of the suburbs of North London. If you go to Sudbury Town Centre, you have this, okay, it's making a gesture towards classicism, but essentially very modern-looking tube station to deliver commuters into the City of London and take them out again, when the ideal of the home that they might be coming home to would be something like that. And we've got examples of it in High Wycombe. In the 1920s and 30s, this model of housing, which had existed before the First World War, absolutely goes into overdrive. And in Britain, I think we can see that that's taking a type of nationalism, and it's a rural nationalism, conservative, backward-looking, and making it the mainstream taste. It appealed to a great many people in the 1920s and 30s, and you can see examples of it up and down the country. That's just near me. That's in Acton. In Germany, there was a fear of that cosmopolitan Bauhaus manner of doing things. Cosmopolitan was another word for international, was another word for Jewish, was another word for, and after all, it was the bankers who stabbed us in the back in the First World War, and if they'd not, those Jewish bankers, done that, then we might have won the First World War. And so Hitler, in trying to restore Germany's historical grandeur, points to historical models and has these incredible schemes for rebuilding Berlin on new imperial lines. So, in a slightly sketchy way, I think we can see that technological changes made new products and means of communication possible, and that these were spurred on by the war. That there was a reaction to many of the things that happened and arose out of the war amongst modernists, and I'm using that in the widest sense, to embrace an ideal of the machine to try and escape some of the things that they had witnessed. And this is the more mainstream taste, that actually there was a rejection of many of the modernist things that came out of that movement, and a desire to retreat to some earlier, safer, more secure and largely mythical past. Thank you very much.